It started with a watch that wouldn't tick. December 26, 1900. A supply ship docks at the edge of the world, Flannan Isles, Scotland. Cold, jagged rock meets an even colder sea. The lighthouse stands in stark silence, its light extinguished. 3 keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, are gone. No signs of struggle, no farewell message, just absence. Inside, the table was set, untouched. A chair lay overturned. The door was closed but not locked. And Ducat's gold pocket watch, documented, logged, and noted, was found sitting on a shelf, stopped at exactly 8:45, frozen in time like everything else in that moment. For 12 years, the North Atlantic held its secret. Then, in 1912, the ocean stirred. A group of fishermen trudging a normally submerged beach stumbled upon something nestled in the sand. A watch, polished gold, engraved, undeniably Ducat's. And here's where the story turns. The watch hadn't aged, no rust, no corrosion, no sign of its voyage through time or sea, as if someone or something had placed it there the day before. The Flannan Isles mystery is woven into maritime folklore. The disappearance has spawned poems, tales, investigations. Yet the watch remains the strangest thread of all. Salt water destroys. Metal perishes. Exposure to air and brine and the relentless rhythm of waves breaks down even the sturdiest object. But this watch? It survived as though untouched by time. There were theories. Perhaps it had been hidden, tucked into a rock crevice, protected from the sea. But no such container was found. The area had been combed by investigators in the years after the disappearance. Nothing. And even so, 12 years is a long time. Too long. Or maybe, as some whispered, the watch hadn't spent those 12 years in our world at all. This is not a story about ghosts or monsters. It's not a parable of punishment or divine retribution. It's a story about something quieter, something stranger. Time. We treat time like a straight line. Events fall behind us, moments ahead rush toward us, always forward, always away. But occasionally, rarely, impossibly, the line loops, or twists, or halts entirely. The Ducat watch is the first of many, a signal not just of a mystery, but of a question. What if memory could lie? What if time could forget? What if objects, once lost, could return, but not in the state we expect? This documentary is not about solving these riddles. It's not about proving the impossible or debunking belief. It is about wonder, about witnessing, about letting the story speak for itself. Over the next 13 chapters, we'll follow 10 objects that vanished, swallowed by war, nature, chance, and returned decades later in pristine, unspoiled condition. Letters that should have yellowed, film that should have disintegrated, flowers that should have crumbled to dust. Each found again, each seemingly preserved by something beyond our understanding. Some believe these stories are about physics we don't yet understand. Others about emotion, memory, and the strange influence of human longing. Some say they are simply hoaxes, mistaken identities, exaggerated claims. That's part of the mystery, too. But here's what remains. 10 objects, 10 impossibilities, 10 echoes of time misbehaving. We begin where the tide first turned, at the edge of Scotland, where a lighthouse once stood in silence and a pocket watch returned as if summoned. If time can stop for a watch, can it stop for a life? This is not just a story about objects. It's a story about us, how we remember, what we lose, and what we hope will one day return. What if a compass could find its way back without ever being seen? In 1925, the dense green of the Amazon swallowed a man whole. Percy Fawcett, explorer, soldier, seeker of the legendary lost city he called Z, walked into the rainforest with his son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh. They were never seen again. The jungle took them without a sound. Fawcett was a meticulous man. He trusted maps, instruments, signs written in the terrain. And above all, he trusted his brass compass, handmade in London, the initials PHF etched into its lid. Precision bearings, glass face, polished to a gleam. That compass was a thread in the labyrinth, meant to guide him home. He never made it. Nearly 3 decades later, in 1952, Brazilian explorer Orlando Vilas Boas found something while tracing riverbanks in the Xingu region, deep in the very lands where Fawcett vanished. A brass compass buried partway in the soft red mud. The initials still legible, PHF. Experts at the Royal Geographical Society confirmed the design, the materials, the craftsmanship. It was Fawcett's. Or it should have been, because it looked as though it had been lost for a year. Maybe 2, not 27. Brass doesn't last in the rainforest. The air is alive with moisture, the soil is acidic. Mold, insects, lichen, all wage war on anything man-made. A compass should corrode, darken, seize up. The needle should rust and stick. The casing should flake. Yet this one hadn't. The face was clear. The mechanism worked. The patina was light, not heavy. The threads that closed the lid were clean. As if the compass had waited, suspended somehow in a bubble of protection. Theories surfaced. Perhaps it had been sheltered inside a container. Perhaps someone had carried it all these years, preserving it. But then why leave it half buried in the open? Why now? No explorer with those initials had been in that area. No duplicate compasses known. Fawcett's was singular, iconic. A compass not just of direction, but of conviction. He had believed in Z, a city of ancient intelligence, predating known history. Many dismissed him, yet he vanished pursuing something he was certain was real. And now the compass had returned, not to him, but to the world. Impossibly preserved, impossibly intact. Some indigenous legends speak of time behaving differently in certain places. Of jungles where the world forgets to turn, where travelers emerge thinking hours have passed when days have flown by, or where nothing ages and memory blurs. Could there be regions where matter waits, where metal sleeps instead of decaying? Fawcett believed the Amazon hid truths. Not monsters or curses, just forgotten knowledge. The compass is now in private hands, its mystery unsolved. Its appearance remains a wound that doesn't close. The last trace of a man who vanished into green silence. What's more remarkable, that the compass was found, or that it remained so perfect. There is something heartbreaking in that perfection. As if the jungle preserved one thing, not to help Percy return, but to remind us that he had once been there. A whisper in brass. So we ask, is it the compass that found its way back? Or are we the ones still lost, trying to make sense of where and when it truly came from? It began with a sound, static, then silence. October 21st, 1978. Pilot Frederick Valentich took off in a small Cessna from Melbourne, bound for King Island across the Bass Strait. It was twilight. The sky was calm. Valentich was 20 years old, an aspiring aviator. Confident. Focused. At 7:06 p.m., he made contact with air traffic control, reporting a strange aircraft circling above him. 4 bright lights. "Ois," he said. "It's not an aircraft. It is." Then nothing. Just a metallic scraping sound. Then silence. Despite a massive search, no wreckage was found. Valentich had vanished. For 5 years there was nothing. No answers. No closure. Then, in 1983, debris washed ashore on Flinders Island. Among the fragments, cockpit instruments consistent with a Cessna. Some serial numbers matched. Hope sparked, then dimmed, because the parts didn't look like they'd spent 5 years at sea. There was no corrosion, no pitting, no barnacles. The instruments were clean, intact, as if they'd only just been submerged. Aviation experts were baffled. Seawater is unforgiving. Aluminum corrodes fast. Paint fades. Rubber seals degrade. Yet these instruments still bore legible markings. The faces were clear. No marine growth. Officially, the Australian government never confirmed the parts belonged to Valentich's plane. Unofficially, those who examined the debris couldn't explain its condition. Where had it been for 5 years? There were theories. Some claimed the parts were planted, thrown into the sea recently to mimic wreckage. Others speculated the parts had been preserved in an unknown location, then displaced by a storm. A few whispered something stranger, that Valentich hadn't just disappeared, but had gone somewhere else. Somewhere outside the reach of ordinary decay. The Bass Strait has long been a place of vanishings. Aircraft, ships, people. It's earned a reputation, a southern counterpart to the Bermuda Triangle. But reputations are often built on repetition, not evidence. Still, Valentich's final words remain chilling. It's not an aircraft. If the instruments were truly from his plane, and if their condition truly defies environmental science, then we are left with two choices. Either someone faked the debris for reasons unknown, or time, once again, chose not to leave its mark. Could an object vanish not just from space, but from time itself? Could it return untouched, like a message in a bottle from a place where rust, rot, and ruin don't exist? Valentich was never found. His family never gave up hope. The instruments sit in storage, reminders not of a crash, but of a question. Where do things go when they're lost? And why do some come back unchanged? Sometimes the sea gives back what it takes, but when it does, and when that gift is too perfect, we must wonder, was it ever lost at all? Some stories begin in fire. This one ends in amber. In 1941, as Nazi forces moved through Russia, they reached the city of Pushkin. There, inside the Catherine Palace, hung a marvel of Baroque art, the Amber Room, 6 tons of fossilized resin, carved, polished, and inlaid with gold leaf. It shimmered like honey in the light. Some called it the 8th wonder of the world. The Nazis dismantled it piece by piece and shipped it to Königsberg Castle in East Prussia. By 1945, as the Allies advanced, it vanished. The Amber Room was never seen whole again. Then, in 1997, during an unrelated investigation, German police found something unexpected. A small decorative panel, unmistakably from the Amber Room, in a private home. The man claimed it had been in his family's basement since the war. His father, he said, had been a soldier. That would mean the panel had spent over 50 years in a German cellar. But it hadn't aged. Amber is not stone. It is organic, born of ancient tree resin. It cracks. It discolors. It warps with humidity and time. Stored improperly, it degrades. Yet this panel was pristine. The surface shone with golden clarity. The gold leaf backing still glimmered. No signs of flaking, no spiderweb cracks, no musty residue of time spent underground. Experts were puzzled. Conditions in post-war Germany, bombed-out buildings, fluctuating temperatures, moisture seeping through concrete, should have left the panel weathered. But here it was, as though lifted straight from the palace walls. Was the man lying? Had he somehow preserved the panel in perfect archival conditions? But when questioned, he described it as simply wrapped in cloth inside a wooden box. Nothing extraordinary, or had something, shielded it, preserved it, protected it? The panel is more than art. It's a remnant of a room meant to awe, to silence. Its return was a whisper instead of a roar. Just one piece, just enough to stir memory. And yet it raises the larger question. If this one piece survived in such improbable condition, what happened to the rest? The Amber Room's disappearance remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of World War II. Rumors persist. Hidden in a mine, burned in the siege, smuggled abroad. But no trace has proven definitive. Except this panel. Out of hiding. Out of time. Perhaps the amber held its own secret. Perhaps the room itself was not just beauty, but boundary, a place where time paused and memory endured. Or perhaps the emotional weight carried by such artifacts grants them a kind of immunity from decay. The panel now rests in a museum, secure, clean, its smooth surface a mirror not just of those who view it, but of the questions we still carry. When something built to last is lost, we mourn its absence. But when it returns untouched, we're left to wonder, was it ever gone? Or did it wait, unchanged, until we were ready to see it again? A battlefield holds many stories, but some refuse to be buried. In 1863, during the American Civil War, a Union soldier named Robert E. Thompson carried with him a Bible, a gift from his family. As legend tells it, the Bible stopped a bullet during battle, sparing his life for a time. Later, in a field hospital, Thompson succumbed to other wounds. His final letter home described the Bible as destroyed. That should have been the end of it. But in 2012, a metal detectorist combing the Chickamauga battlefield in Georgia unearthed something strange. 6 inches below the surface, wrapped in decaying cloth, was a leather-bound Bible. Inside the cover, a nameplate. Robert E. Thompson, Company D, 21st Ohio, Volunteer Infantry. It was his. Yet the Bible was whole, untorn, untouched. The leather cover, while worn, was soft and intact. The pages were yellowed but legible, no mold, no insect damage, no bullet hole. This was impossible. Georgia soil is acidic. Paper disintegrates. Leather rots. For 150 years, that Bible should have been nothing but dust. And yet there it was. Historians authenticated it. The typeface, the binding, the materials, all matched 1850s printings. The nameplate matched official records. It was not a replica, but there were inconsistencies. The Bible's condition was more like something buried 20 years ago, not 150, and the location where it was found didn't match records of Thompson's final position during the battle. How had it ended up there, and how had it remained so intact? Theories emerged. Perhaps someone found the Bible after the war and buried it later. But why bury an artifact of such personal and historical significance? And how would they have known it belonged to Thompson? Or perhaps Thompson's account was mistaken. Perhaps the Bible was never destroyed. But his letter was clear. It had taken a bullet. He described it in detail. A tearful moment of grace amid chaos. One more theory. That time bent just briefly for that object. That something, grief, faith, love, preserved it. Not by physical means, but by presence, by meaning. The Bible now rests in a glass case in a battlefield museum, displayed not as a holy relic, but as a question, one that trembles at the edge of understanding. How do we measure time for an object tied to memory? How do we explain preservation that defies every law we know? Perhaps the Bible did not resist decay on its own. Perhaps it was held in the hands of hope, unseen, until it could be found again. A testament not just of faith, but of return. When we say an object survived the war, we usually mean it wasn't lost. This Bible was lost, and somehow it came back, not as it should have been, but as if time had touched it and decided to let go. It was never worn, yet it waited perfectly for love to return. In 1850, a young woman named Anna Baker stood in her bedroom in the family mansion in Altoona, Pennsylvania, holding a gold wedding ring. Her lover, a man her wealthy father deemed unworthy, had proposed. But the union was forbidden. The ring, a symbol of promise, was cast away, some say by Anna herself, others by her father in anger. Anna never married. She lived her entire life in that house, surrounded by memories and silence. When she died in 1914, the ring was long gone, lost, forgotten, a relic of a love unfulfilled. Then, in 1926, during renovations to turn the mansion into a museum, workers discovered something hidden behind a crumbling plaster wall in Anna's bedroom. A velvet ring box, its fabric water-stained and fragile. Inside, a gold ring, inscribed with the initials AEB and EG. The date, June 1850. It was Anna's. But the ring was flawless. Jewelry experts examined it. They expected wear, scratches, metal fatigue. Instead, the surface gleamed. The engravings were crisp. The band showed no signs of bending or decay, not even the expected patina of old gold. It looked as though it had been made yesterday, not hidden in a wall for 76 years. Gold doesn't tarnish like silver, but it does age. The environment behind the wall, subject to decades of temperature changes, humidity, dust, should have marked it. Yet it hadn't. How? Some said the ring was a replica, planted later. But why would anyone fake such an item, only to hide it? Others said Anna herself might have polished it over the years before sealing it away. But it was found in a deteriorated box. No sign of human touch for decades. The most romantic explanation? That Anna never stopped waiting. That her longing somehow kept the ring as perfect as the day it was given. Today, the ring sits near Anna's unworn wedding dress in the Baker Mansion Museum. Both are said to be centers of paranormal activity. Visitors report cold spots, strange feelings, even whispered voices near the glass case. But whether or not spirits linger, the ring's return asks something simpler. Can an object hold on to emotion? Can love, deferred but not denied, shelter something from time? We often measure value in materials, but this ring defies that. It wasn't just gold, it was memory, it was potential, and when it came back, it hadn't aged a day. Maybe it wasn't time that preserved it, maybe it was the love that never got to be. He vanished into the jungle. His compass came back alone. Percy Fawcett believed in a city, Zid he called it, a lost civilization hidden deep in the Amazon, older than anything in the history books. In 1925, he set out to find it, accompanied by his son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh. They entered the forest, wrote one last letter from a place called Dead Horse Camp, and disappeared. No one knows what happened. They were never seen again. In 1952, 27 years later, a Brazilian explorer named Orlando Vilas Boas was charting rivers in the same region. Near the muddy edge of a remote tributary, half buried in silt, he found something glinting in the sun. A brass compass. It was old but intact, the glass face uncracked. The needle still turned smoothly, and on the lid, 3 letters engraved with precision. PHF. Percy Harrison Fawcett. It had to be his. Brass doesn't survive in the Amazon. Not like that. The humidity, the acidic soil, the relentless heat, everything conspires to destroy metal. Within months, green patina forms. Within years, corrosion eats through. But this compass looked like it had only recently been exposed. Experts agreed. The style matched 1920s London-made surveyor instruments. The initials matched. The condition didn't. How could a brass compass spend nearly 3 decades in the Amazon and come out with only surface tarnish? How could the glass remain sigil clear, the threads still screw shut, the internal mechanism functional? Vilas Boas reached out to the Royal Geographical Society. Photos were sent, reports compiled, no container was found, no explanation offered. One theory suggested the compass had been stored in dry conditions, protected, and only recently discarded. But by whom? And why? No other explorer with those initials was known in the region. Others turned to local legends. The Amazon, they say, is not just a place. It's a presence. Some tribes speak of regions where time behaves differently, places where objects and people slip between states. We don't know where Fawcett died, or if he did. Some believe he found what he was looking for and chose to stay. Others think he was taken by illness or hostility. But the compass reappeared as if drawn back by unseen hands. Perhaps it returned to be found. Perhaps, like Fawcett himself, it had traveled beyond the ordinary flow of time. Not in science fiction terms, but in the deeply human sense that meaning can protect memory. That belief itself can bend the world. The compass remains with Fawcett's descendants. It's rarely shown. Some say it still works perfectly. We look at it now not as a tool, but as a message, a final echo from a man who vanished chasing a dream. And we wonder, did the compass come back because he didn't? Or is it still pointing toward a place we've yet to understand? In 1943, love crossed oceans, then vanished into silence. Jean Hilliard was 19 years old, living in rural Minnesota. Her fiancé, Robert, was deployed in the Pacific during World War II. They wrote letters, dozens of them, their words folded in envelopes that traveled across the globe like lifelines. Jean kept Robert's letters in a wooden box carved by her father. It sat on her nightstand, a private archive of love and longing. Then, one summer day, while the family was at church, someone broke into the house. Jewelry was taken, some cash. But most devastating of all, the box of letters. Gone. Jean was never the same. Robert came home. They married, lived full lives. But she never stopped mourning those letters. When she died in 1993, the box was still lost until 2 years later. In 1995, a construction crew demolishing an old barn 3 miles away discovered a wooden box tucked into the rafters. Weathered, roped in place. Inside, 60 letters, all addressed to Jean Hilliard, all in Robert's handwriting. The contents were immaculate. Paper from the 1940s should have yellowed, cracked. Ink should have faded. Envelopes should have curled, torn, mildewed. But these were fresh. White paper, flexible. Ink jet black. No foxing, no mold. Even the thin, wartime envelopes were legible. It was as if they had just arrived by mail. And the barn, unheated, uninsulated. Gaps in the walls, winters below zero, summers humid and hot. The worst possible conditions for paper preservation. And yet the letters defied it all. How did they get there? Who took them? Why preserve them for 50 years only to leave them behind? Some believed a jealous neighbor had stolen them, then hidden them away. But why go through the trouble of keeping them? And how did they survive so perfectly? Others whispered something more mysterious. Perhaps Jean's longing left an imprint, some emotional residue that shielded those letters from decay. Perhaps love is not just metaphor, but a force we do not yet measure. The letters now live in the Minnesota Historical Society archives, handled with gloves, stored in climate-controlled rooms. But for 52 years, they survived in a place where they shouldn't have lasted 5. Jean never saw them again. But maybe, in a way, they waited until she no longer needed them, until it was time to let someone else read those words and believe in their power. So we ask, what is a letter, really? Ink on paper? Or something more, a vessel for hope, sent across not just distance, but time? In a world so quick to forget, perhaps these letters came back to remind us. Some messages never stop trying to be heard. Sometimes the sea gives back what it takes. almost untouched. In 1966, James Sullivan, an underwater photographer, was diving off the Florida Keys. He was capturing images of coral reefs with his Nikon F camera encased in a custom aluminum underwater housing. That day, a storm rolled in fast. His boat capsized. Sullivan made it to shore, but his equipment was lost beneath the waves. 43 years later, in 2009, a recreational diver named Tom Matthews was exploring the same reef. While scanning a rocky crevice, he noticed something encrusted in marine growth. He pried it free. It was a metal housing, nearly unrecognizable. But inside, preserved beyond reason, was the impossible: Sullivan's Nikon. Serial number N6531452. A perfect match. The outer housing showed corrosion, yes, barnacles, marineware. But inside, the camera was almost pristine. The internal components were intact. The shutter still clicked. And most astonishing of all, there was film inside. Kodachrome, unprocessed. 43 years beneath the ocean. Photography experts were skeptical. Salt water, even indirect, destroys film. It clouds the emulsion, warps the base, pressure warps spools. But when the film was carefully developed, images emerged. Not perfectly. Some fogging, some softening. But the photos were real. Reef fish, corals, sunlit water from 1966. A lost reel of time. How did it survive? One theory: the housing remained sealed for decades, only leaking near the end. But marine growth suggested long exposure. The housing was not airtight. It had openings. Another: a hoax. But Sullivan, then 78, confirmed the serial number. The photos matched his style. The film stock tested as vintage. Perhaps it wasn't the camera, but the film, the unique chemistry of Kodachrome, known for its longevity. Still, the odds were minuscule. The deeper question: why now? Why after 43 years? James Sullivan called it a gift, a message from the sea. The camera held not just images but memories he had forgotten, snapshots from a younger man's eye. He died 3 years later, having seen them one last time. The camera now sits in a photography museum, both artifact and enigma. Its film, displayed frame by frame, is a timeline that defied erosion. When something is lost to the ocean, we assume it's gone forever. But sometimes it waits, not preserved by design, but by something stranger, a pause in decay, a pocket of stillness in the chaos. What if memory can anchor an object? What if the act of recording a moment gives it a kind of immunity to time? This wasn't just a camera recovered, it was a moment returned. Proof that some images never fade, even when the sea tries to take them. Some capsules are meant to be opened in the future. This one opened itself. In 1958, students at Westfield High School in New Jersey buried a time capsule. It was a ceremonial act: newspapers, letters to the future, a vinyl record, photographs, a yearbook, and a small bouquet of freshly picked daisies meant to represent fleeting youth. The metal box was sealed, lowered into a cavity in the new gymnasium's foundation, and entombed in concrete. A plaque nearby marked its place with instructions: do not open until June 2008. The decades passed. The school grew. Generations of students came and went. But when 2008 arrived, and the school prepared to unearth the capsule for its 50-year celebration, it was gone. Excavation revealed nothing. Ground-penetrating radar showed no trace. Blueprints were rechecked. Every inch of the expected location was explored. Nothing. Then, in 2003, 5 years before its scheduled opening, construction workers performing routine maintenance on a wall discovered a void. Inside, wedged between beams, was a metal box. The plaque from 1958 rested atop it. It was the capsule, but it hadn't been in the foundation. It was in a wall that didn't even exist in 1958. The wall had been added in a 1965 renovation. Somehow the capsule had moved. And the contents? They should have shown their age, but they didn't. The newspapers were crisp, the record played clearly, the yearbook was unwarped, and the flowers, the daisies, were fresh. Not dried, not pressed. Fresh. Petals white, stems green, scented, as though picked that very morning. Within hours, the flowers wilted. But when first opened, witnesses swore they were alive. How could this be? Botanists were baffled. No soil, no moisture, no sunlight. Flowers do not remain fresh in sealed containers for 45 years. Nor can a sealed metal box relocate itself into a wall added 7 years after burial. Some suggested hoax, that the school replaced the original capsule with a modern recreation. But the materials matched 1958. The record was vintage. The yearbook identical to archived copies. The capsule itself, scratched and aged, was clearly original. Another theory: someone had opened the capsule during renovations and hidden it in the wall, but the welds were intact. The box was sealed. Some dared to ask, had the capsule skipped time altogether? Time is something we think of as linear, but stories like this challenge that. What if certain places, certain objects, step outside for a moment? What if they return only when we're ready? The time capsule now sits in a glass case at Westfield High. The flowers, dried within days, are preserved behind acrylic. But for a moment, they lived again. The students who buried that capsule dreamed of the future. And maybe, just maybe, the future dreamed back. We bury things to mark time, to measure it. But sometimes, time has its own plan, and when it reveals what it has hidden, the result is not just surprise, it's awe. A reminder that even time can bend to sentiment, and that memory, like flowers, can bloom again when we least expect it. Not everything lost is forgotten, and not everything returned makes sense. In 1922, Margaret Chen was moving into a new apartment in San Francisco. Amid the chaos, she noticed one item missing: her grandfather's gold pocket watch. Passed down from the 1880s, it was her most treasured heirloom. Engraved, delicate, it ticked with the memory of generations. She searched for weeks, checked boxes, asked friends, retraced steps. Nothing. The watch was gone, a casualty of transition. She mourned it quietly for the rest of her life. She died in 2001. 17 years later, in 2018, her granddaughter Amy received an anonymous package in the mail. No return address, just a neatly wrapped parcel in red silk. Inside, the watch. And a note, handwritten in formal Chinese. 66 years borrowed, time held in reverence. It is time to return this. With apologies. Amy gasped. The watch was unmistakable. The engraving matched family photos. The serial number matched Margaret's records. But the condition, it was flawless. No scratches, no tarnish, no worn-down spring. The gears moved freely. The hands kept perfect time. Even the gold luster was as bright as if polished yesterday. A horologist examined it, confirmed its age, authentic 19th century craftsmanship. And yet, he said, it looked like it had never been worn. That shouldn't be possible. Even in ideal conditions, old watches show wear. Air causes slow corrosion. Bearings loosen, springs unwind. But this one? As if it had spent 66 years in a vacuum. So where had it been? The handwriting on the note suggested someone older, educated, traditional. But no one came forward. No fingerprints, no DNA. The silk was hand-dyed, vintage. Family theories emerged. Some said someone close to Margaret took it, intending to return it. But 66 years? And why after her death? One theory held more poetry than proof, that the watch had gone with Margaret when she passed, and returned to this world only when her story was ready to continue. Not a theft, a borrowing. By time itself. Amy keeps the watch now. She wears it on quiet days. Sometimes, she says, she finds it in places she didn't leave it. She speaks to it sometimes, not because she expects a reply, but because she believes it listens. What is time if not the measure of presence? And what is presence if something dear can vanish and return untouched? We believe objects are passive, but perhaps, like people, they remember. They respond. They return when called by the quiet pull of memory. Or maybe some things, just a few, carry time inside them, held still, held safe. And when they return, it's not to surprise us. It's to remind us we're still part of their story. Sometimes what disappears isn't just an object. It's a piece of us. The stories of lost things returning usually come with hard edges. A recovered watch, a found compass, a resurfaced dust letter. But some stories have softer outlines, more feeling than fact. The objects return, yes, but so do the questions. All 10 objects shared in this journey vanished. That alone is not rare. We lose things all the time, to chaos, to forgetfulness. But when they returned, they came back different. Not just misplaced and found, preserved, against nature, against entropy, against the slow erosion we expect. A Bible unearthed without decay, a wedding ring gleaming as if newly cast, a camera with film that defied salt and pressure, a compass that didn't corrode in the Amazon, letters that braved 50 years of winter without yellowing. Each item was supposed to be gone, changed, ruined, but each returned, as if paused. These aren't tales of ghosts or curses. They're tales of thresholds, where emotion meets physics, where memory meets matter. The emotional weight tied to each object is undeniable. Love, loss, longing, hope. Maybe that's the key. We can try to explain these events with reason. Hypothesize perfect conditions, airtight boxes, buried dry pockets in walls or soil. We can argue for misremembered dates or replaced artifacts. But even when we do, a strange thing happens. The emotional truth stays stronger than the logical one. And that tells us something. Humans are pattern makers, meaning seekers. When something breaks our expectations, like fresh daisies in a 50-year-old box, we don't just want answers. We want connection. The final mystery is not how these objects returned. It's why they returned the way they did. At significant moments, near places tied to the people who loved them, on anniversaries, during renovations, when families were ready or gone. Perhaps these returns are less about the objects and more about us. Perhaps the past is more present than we think. And perhaps memory, when strong enough, leaves behind echoes that wait quietly until someone listens. The true enigma isn't the object that endures. It's the human heart that calls it back. Because time doesn't always flow forward. Sometimes it circles. Sometimes it loops back. And sometimes, just sometimes, it lets something return. What does it mean for something to come back untouched? Across this journey, we've seen objects defy time's touch, watches gleaming after decades, paper unbrittled by age, metal unmarked by rot. They reappeared not as ruins of the past, but as echoes of moments that refused to fade, and patterns emerged. Emotional weight tied each object to its owner. The wedding ring symbolizing forbidden love, letters representing connection across war, a Bible that shielded its carrier, a watch gifted across generations. These weren't random belongings, they were extensions of the self, artifacts charged with feeling. Many returned at pivotal moments, some just after a person's death, others during renovations or anniversaries. The timing feels purposeful, as though the object waits, not for chance, but for meaning. Even their movements were strange. Time capsules ended up behind walls that didn't exist when they were sealed. Cameras were found miles from where they sank. Compasses surfaced far from where their owners disappeared. It's not just their preservation that's remarkable. It's their placement. It's as though these objects don't return at random. They return when someone is ready to witness them. Skeptics raise valid questions. Maybe the items weren't as exposed as claimed. Maybe someone protected them unknowingly. Maybe the stories were embellished. That's the burden of mystery. It leaves room for doubt. But if every scientific explanation still leaves us unsettled, maybe the point isn't to solve the mystery. Maybe it's to acknowledge that mystery exists. We live in an age where everything is time-stamped, logged, archived. Yet these stories suggest that some things resist categorization. Some things survive not through protection, but through purpose. And maybe, just maybe, memory isn't as fragile as we think. What if the act of remembering is what calls these objects back? What if objects tied to deep human feeling operate outside linear time? Not in the science fiction sense, but in the quiet way grief, love, and longing preserve more than we can measure. A gold ring hidden in a wall. A watch returned in silence. A letter that arrives decades too late, but right on time. These are more than lost and found tales. They are reminders that some things are not truly lost, that memory itself might be a force of nature, that when we feel something deeply enough, it leaves an imprint, not just on us, but perhaps, impossibly, on the world. And in those rare moments when the past comes back unaged, unearthed, untouched, we are not just looking at an object, we are looking at a mirror, one that reflects not what was, but what still lives inside us, waiting, always waiting, until it is time to return. Epilogue: The Edge of Time. In the end, all that remains are questions, not about where these objects were, but what they meant when they returned. A stopped watch, a pristine ring, a camera whispering light from a lost afternoon. Each came back to us not simply as artifacts, but as answers to questions we didn't know we were asking. What if time isn't absolute? What if memory, longing, grief, and even love can hold something in place untouched? In science, we speak of half-lives and entropy, but in life we measure in presence, in the ache of absence, in the miracle of return. Across these stories, the impossible has brushed against the ordinary. Time bent, decay deferred, not because the world forgot the rules, but because someone, somewhere, remembered the soldier with the Bible, the daughter and her suitor's ring, the letters that carried love across war-torn oceans, the compass that still pointed home. And maybe that's what this was all about, not time travel, not hidden technology, but the idea that some things are carried by emotion so strong they refuse to follow the same laws as everything else. We are, all of us, made of stories, of things we've lost, of things we wait for. And in those stories we keep small flames burning, quiet hopes, invisible ties. Sometimes the world answers. It places a box behind a wall, a letter in the rafters, a watch in the sand, and we, stunned, lift it from where it waited, not to explain it, but to hold it, to feel the weight of memory, to say, I see you, and to wonder with new eyes, what else have we lost that might still be on its way home? This journey through time ends not with proof, but with possibility, not with certainty, but with awe, because maybe the deepest human truth is this: the past is not past, the future is not fixed, and sometimes when we least expect it, time gives something back.